Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to St. Peter Mancroft. Welcome to those who are joining us here in church, but also, of course, those who are joining online, which is also very handy if you're watching, if you're in church and you're listening, but you forget some bits. So do have a look on St. Peter Mancroft website, where you'll be able to catch all of this year's Heritage Open Day talks, as well as the last year's as well. So you should be all very good on your history about Norwich and, of course, the specific things pertaining to St. Peter Mancroft. This morning, the table set before us, laden with cake, my favourite subject, is being given by Dr. Mary Fewster, who's specialist in sort of church silver, ecclesiastical silver. Mary is going to take us through the dining habits over the years, starting at what we would have done in the medieval period and then taking us up to date in the 20th century. And afterwards, I'm sure that Mary would be available, and if you wanted to come and have a more closer look at some of the items, you'd be very welcome to do so. Is that okay? Yeah. So on your behalf, may I ask you to welcome Mary in the traditional manner.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be back here again, sharing with you some of my interests, and particularly looking at silver as part of the table scene, but not focusing solely on silver this time. And as Chris says, we're going to start at the beginning of the Middle Ages, looking at what dining was like back at the time of the Bear Tapestry. Oh, it does help if I switch it on, doesn't it? The Bear Tapestry gives us an early example of dining, quite lavish dining for the time. So here we have the traditional way in which a table would have been set. People would have sat one side of it so that they could be served by the pages, as you will see at the front there, and then they would be drinking from bowls usually, and the food would be on great platters. What they didn't have, of course, was any ordinary tableware or cutlery. They might have used their dagger, and they would have, if it was liquid, as I say, they would have drunk it from bowls, but otherwise the food could just have been put on the table or on a trencher. And we'll come to, oh, what have I done? Oh, okay, we're back. Now, so let's have a look at the bowls. They would have probably been wooden, except in very rich households. We know there were far before this, right back into very ancient times, there would have been drinking bowls. We know that a set of Saxon, or a set of silver bowls, was found in the Sutton Hoo ship, which was actually made in Byzantium. So back in the Saxon era, they would have expected to have, on the king's table, to have had silver drinking bowls. But frequently, as I say, they were wood and rimmed perhaps with silver. Here you have an example of a drinking bowl made much later. This fashion continued into the 17th century. So we have a Norwich mazer. I think the wood was maple, and the silver rim would have been made by a local goldsmith. And these continued to be fashionable and to be used. At the moment, the castle is reinventing itself, returning to the original floor levels and putting back the great hall that would have been there when the castle was built. It was built as a royal palace, and the king was expecting, and did come, to hold court there and to dine there. And so that's what they will be reinstalling, this grand banquet of 1120, when the king came to Norwich. And you will see in the picture an illustration of what they hope it will be. 3 tables round 3 sides of a square. Again, we're dining on one side and service on the other. And again, it would be with the big dishes, the platters containing the food, drinking vessels of some sort, Very little in the way of plates and very little in the way of cutlery. I don't know how well you can see this image. This shows a traditional serving dish. In fact, the picture on the left is from a medieval manuscript, bringing in a peacock, cooked but then redressed in its feathers. It wasn't a live peacock squatting on the dish. This was upmarket consumption on what looks like a silver gilt dish. And a similar dish, but with a very different purpose, can be seen in the cathedral treasury, because the Oxnead communion plate includes a massive collection plate. Now, Oxnead's a small village. I cannot imagine that it would ever have had sufficient congregation to have made a serving dish size collection plate necessary. And my feeling is that this plate originated at Oxnead Hall with the Paston family and was part of its grand dining set. But these plates were not necessarily for use. They were often for ornament. You may be able to see here the Windsor Castle banquet, a modern banquet set up for the Queen, and apart from the tables, which now are seating each side of the table and not with service from behind instead of in front, which was the medieval custom. But the key thing to look at here is the two buffets of plate, because dining was not just consuming food. Particularly if it was a grand banquet, it was going to be impressing your guests. And if you weren't using particular pieces of plate, you put them on a side table or buffet so that they could be seen by everybody. You wanted to show off what you got. And so here, both sides of the room, in fact, you can see the one that's lit up slightly to the right of the center of the screen very clearly. Even today, there is a buffet of plate. And both grand families and civic dignitaries would have set up a buffet of plate as part of the dining experience. In fact, we know that the Norwich City Corporation had quite a spectacular collection of plate that it would set out on a buffet, because when there was a plot in 1570 to I have to say, massacre the Dutch population of Norwich, one of their first jobs that they intended to do was to ride into St Andrew's Hall, where there was going to be a civic banquet at the time, and steal the buffet to fund their enterprise. Even in church, this buffet idea, after the Reformation, became quite a common feature, to using the altar as the buffet, because communion was very rarely held. So if you've got an altar or a table, you want to make use of it for something. And this is the period where you start getting grander collection plates and flagons and various other vessels. And if you weren't using them, you put them on the altar. And this is shown at Queen Victoria's coronation, when quite a bit of the plate that is now part of the Crown Jewels exhibition actually turns up on the altar. And you can see it particularly in the right-hand picture. The wonderful flagons, the feathered flagons, and the great plates that would have been part of the Tudor dining experience. A Norwich Corporation's plate had quite a bit, and it grew over time. So in 1544, we find that they've got 3 goblets. This is belonging to the corporation. It wouldn't be the only plate they used. I suspect the corporation members would bring stuff from home as well. They've got 2 salts. We'll come back to salts. A spoon with the image of St. Peter. A standing bowl, white, which is ungilded, means silver. A standing cup, that's like a wine glass, wine cup on a stem. Of Flanders making, 6 spoons with diamond heads, and a pounce piece, which means a sort of engraved or a decorated piece with part I'll say that again. Parcel gilt is only part of the vessel is gilded. Sometimes the rim, sometimes the foot. Sometimes they put a band around the middle, just a gilt, and the rest is still white silver. And we've got some examples on the table when you come to have a look. Hopefully this, it does work. So we have a spoon. Well, our image is not of St. Peter, but of St. Matthew. We've got our medieval setting, which I'll come back to. If you want to see some standing cups, I shall refer to them later. There are one or two good examples in the treasury here. Salts, again, I will have a look at. Oh, I've done it again. Cups came in all shapes and sizes. The corporation had been given two rather nice, what are called flat cups, very shallow, like a drinking bowl on a stem, basically. And the Bleverhasset, or sometimes it's Blennerhasset family, gave this pair, and we get one of the most wonderful confusions from these gifts, because sometime later, one of the leading goldsmiths, who was a member of the corporation, gave the corporation a cup. This was traditional because if you were appointed to an office and didn't want to take up that office, you had to give a piece of plate to the corporation for their dining as a fine, basically, and he did. He gave quite a large cup to the corporation, and they decided that they would get another of the goldsmiths, the one who they tended to use for all their work, to remake it to match the other two cups. So here at the top we have the Blennerhasset cups, and underneath we have the third cup. Now the third cup was remade from this cup given by Peter Peterson. It was remade, though, by William Cobbold. But in the tradition, if you remade a piece of plate, then you put the name of the original donor on it. So Cobbold dutifully wrote round the bowl of the cup, this cup, he wrote the most hereof, meaning most of this vessel, was made by Peter Peterson. The reason he said most was they added some extra silver to it to make the shape. In the 19th century, when people started to get interested in these things, they looked at the mark on the cup, they read the inscription and said, the mark, which is the Auburn cross, was Peter Peterson's mark. No, it wasn't. It was William Cobbold's mark. And for about 50-odd years, people were under this illusion. And even today, you find in articles where people haven't gone back to the later research, just referred to the original Victorian research, you'll find pieces of plates made by William Cobbold acknowledged as being made by Peter Peterson. There's a lovely example in the treasury. The communion cup, called the Peterson cup, was made by William Cobbold. So, perfect example there. Another item that often found its way to the buffet, but was of practical use, was a ewer and basin, because most of eating was still done with the hands. You cut your meat with a dagger. If you were using soup, then you would bring a spoon. Frequently, you would bring your own spoon to these things. If you had, as the corporation did, half a dozen spoons, well, that was considered to be a mark of wealth. And they wouldn't necessarily be a set, because they might have been acquired at different times. So there wasn't any expectation they should match each other. But obviously, if you were eating with your hands most of the time, you needed to rinse your hands. So ewers and basins were an integral part of the dining experience, but then would frequently find their way onto the buffet. On the left is the drawing that we have of the Yewer Basin that was given to the city by Matthew Parker, who was Queen Elizabeth's Archbishop of Canterbury, who was born in Norwich and whose parents are buried at St Clement's Church. He had a drawing made of it, and it was given in perpetuity. Sadly, perpetuity only lasted until the 18th century when they decided to melt it down. But at least we have the drawing. But on the right, we have, and they still have in the corporation collection, a Yewer Basin given by one of the Howard family, one of the Dukes of Norfolk family, to the corporation. This, though, has been altered. The boss in the middle is not the original. The original is underneath that one, but it seems that probably the ewer didn't sit happily on the original boss. So for safety, they've put another one over the top. So back to the medieval scene, this very plain table, which we've illustrated at the far end, some few pieces of bread. You're probably wondering why there are some large pieces of bread there. You will discover. There would be a salt, and that would be perhaps the central feature of the table. We still talk about being above or below the salt. It was, again, a showpiece. Salt was very important in dining, not just to savour food, but of course to preserve it. And so the salt became a central feature of the medieval dining table. Some were quite small, not that high. You can see one here in what is obviously a royal banquet, and you can see this little castle-looking object. That is a salt, but it wouldn't necessarily be all full of salt. What you would find is a tiny dish in the top, and nothing explains this better than the reed salt, which is the finest piece of provincial plate, finest piece of plate outside London, and it's owned by the corporation. It was given by a man called Peter Reed. As you can see, he bequeathed £20 for either a salt or a bowl with a cover, meaning a stemmed cup with a cover, the same to remain and serve the mayor and his successors forever. It remains. Sadly, it doesn't serve the mayor and his successors because it's in a case and it, shut away. But we took the opportunity when we had an exhibition of silver in Norwich Cathedral Treasury in 2004 to do the next best thing. A couple of copies have been made, and Christopher Hartop, who is one of the local leading experts on silver, has one of these copies. So when we had a dinner as part of this exhibition, if you can see that, the mayor at the time, when she dined, had this copy of the reed salt in front of her. She was definitely above the salt. If you were one of the people on the high table, of course, you were above the salt. If you were not, you were below the salt. And this was the defining factor of your status. But it is show. You've got this enormous cover that comes down to there. You've then got, when you take the cover off, you've got a shallow bowl that just fits in the top of this, and the rest of it is just an empty drum, which is just there for show. It was intended to impress, and it still does. But if you were an more ordinary person of the gentry, or maybe even a rich yeoman farmer, you would afford a little silver salt like this, which would be on your table and show your status. And during the 16th century, more people were acquiring more things. Wealth was going up, and people wanted to show their wealth off in their possessions for the table. This was where you invited people. So, I would just point out, the mayor of the time could take the civic plate home with him. If he was dining at home, he was still representing the city. So he would be allowed to take home any pieces of the civic plate that he liked, on his dining table, and the reed salt would undoubtedly have been one of those important pieces that he would have. William Harrison, who was a bit of an old misery. If there was something to moan about, William Harrison would find it. And he didn't necessarily approve of this increased grandeur among going further and further down the social scale. So we find that he's talking about the exchange of vessel, treen into pewter. Well, we haven't got any treen, but I've got a picture. Treen means wooden things. Pewter, you can see some examples of pewter plates and salt cellars and mugs at the far end of the table. So common were all sorts of treen stuff in old times that a man should hardly find 4 pieces of pewter, of which one was peradventure a salt, so one of those pieces would have been a salt in a good farmer's house now. A fair garnish, meaning a set, the sort you would put on the buffet, a set of plates, a couple of tankards, a few mugs, that sort of thing, on his cupboard, which means a side table, not a thing with drawers. With so much odd vessel going about his house, a silver salt, a bowl, meaning a cup for wine, if not a whole nest, which suggests he's thinking of mazer-type bowls that could stack inside each other, and a dozen spoons. So he was saying these people are going up in the world, and he was not 100% keen on the idea. People should stay in their place was one of his constantly echoed ideas. If you can see, this is a trencher, a wooden trencher. But the original trenchers were not made of wood. They were bread. And somebody described as a good trencherman would be someone who consumed plenty of the stuff that was on the bread and probably the bread itself. But they then went over to wooden trenchers, which of course in modern dining have come back into fashion. What goes around comes around. This was the original idea of the trencher. This is a modern version. They tend to be flat. Bread was much denser and bigger in those days. There's a lot of reference to what is called a quartern loaf, which is an 8-pound loaf, which was produced as a flattish loaf. So you've got these large oval or round slices, which we've used a modern loaf to try and replicate there. And you would pile the food on it. And then, of course, the gravy would soak into the bread, so you could, if you wanted, eat the bread. If you were generous or you didn't want any more, that is where the dole cupboard came in, because any food left over and the bread, which would contain the gravy, the goodness of the food, would then be put in a cupboard outside the door where the poor could come and get it. So you would give your generosity and your charity to the poor from your very good quality food that you were eating in the house. But here we have a modern trencher, which is a large loaf dug out to form like a bowl that you would put your food in. And in a way you can see this. This is I think it's an Italian or French picture, but it nevertheless shows on the table you've got the big serving dishes, and then you've got these circular dishes or circular plates, which I think are probably trenchers. Completely flat. They don't look like bowls that you would have. So I think they are probably trenchers. And of course, your wine bowls, you can see at the side here, a wine bowl being refilled from a flagon. The wine was not brought to the table in those days, not the flagon. In those days, the servants would take the bowls or the cups to a side table and serve it there. Going back to wooden trenchers, they weren't always as solid and possibly rough as you might think. Some of them were extremely delicate, and in the Castle Museum, a set belonging to the city was found in a cardboard box, I believe, on top of a cupboard, as you'll frequently find these old things. And they are a set of dessert trenchers, or sweetmeat trenchers, and they are very finely decorated. They're very thin, and they would have been put out at the end of the meal. All the food would be put on the table for the main course, but usually after the main courses, when it came down to what we would consider to be the coffee and biscuits, and that for them was the sort of sweetmeats and sweet wines, then the table would be cleared, and these new, delicate, painted trenchers would be used. And I think I put one, a large one at the side there. And if you haven't seen them, they are in the Art of Living gallery, and they're well worth seeing. They're very, very beautiful. For most people, dining was a simple experience. This 17th century picture, usually said to be a Puritan family, but I think that's partly because everything looks very plain, so it probably was just an ordinary middle-class family. Again, you can see very little on the table, but they are using spoons. And the spoon has a particular quality because although it's part of dining, it's also, particularly in these days, we're talking about 16th, 17th century, it is a personal possession. Frequently they were given on special occasions, and therefore the person would take their spoon with them, as I've said, when they went out for a meal, and it was part of their own personality in a way. A very simple spoon here from the Tictum collection, which some of which is on display in the Treasury, shows what's called a slip end, which means it hasn't got a knop on the end of any sort. And you can see the whole family is using spoons, really, to eat. A lot of the food would be stews and pottage and things like that, so you needed a spoon. Here is a collection of spoons made in the Waveney Valley in the 16th century. But as you will see, when we talk about sets, if this turned up in a household, no two are alike. They were bought as individual things, and often as a christening spoon, for a wedding, or for some special occasion. And here we have an example, a portrait of Lord Cobham and his family. Now, it's difficult to guess what the occasion is, but quite clearly the focus of the painting is the little girl in the middle, who is very firmly clutching her spoon. But she looks a bit old for it to be a christening spoon, unless she liked her spoon and they felt. We have to remember that what goes in a portrait is what the sitters wanted in a portrait. And so she was obviously being identified in connection with this spoon. And the others have other items, like the windmill, for example, the little boy is holding, which might be indicative of their particular likes. And we do find spoons having this personal quality because they are given in wills, they're passed on. Godparents would give spoons to their godchildren, and then when the father made his will, he would ensure that that spoon was left to the child. Particularly important, of course, if the child is a woman, because women's rights of ownership over things, and if they're grown up and married, they technically don't own anything. Everything becomes their husband's. So if your father wants to ensure that you have something, he needs to ensure that it's given to you as a personal possession. And people would pass on a particularly valued piece of plate sometimes in their will. I just picked out 3 there. And notice they all come from yeoman families, farming families. By this time, the idea of having a silver spoon is quite normal, it seems, in many farming families. Because this is where the silver spoon in your mouth comes from. Silver was, and is, it's an antiseptic metal. Germs do not survive long on silver, which is why a communal communion cup is not necessarily pass on any disease. The time it takes to take the cup and pass it to the next person is sufficient to kill the germs. And that's added to by the fact that wine itself also has an antiseptic quality, so it's perfectly safe. You probably get more germs if you wipe the cup than if you don't. But that's beside the point. But silver was one way. If you gave a child a silver spoon, you were helping that child's survival. They didn't understand germs in those days, but we have to remember they did understand something about the qualities of silver. Early surgeons' instruments were made of silver. And if you look at many spoons, these are 4 spoons that were made in Suffolk at the beginning of the 17th century. And many spoons are engraved either on the knob, but particularly at this period on the back. Spoons would be laid on the table face down because that ensured that the front of the spoon was clean, because you never know what might be dropping from the ceiling above. And so here we have 3 of the 4 have initials and in 2 cases dates on them. EW 1613 on this one, we've got TN on this one, 1601 EG on this one, suggesting that they were all christening spoons. Sometimes you get 3 initials, 1 at the top and 2 underneath, and that suggests it's a wedding spoon, because then 1 at the top would be the surname, and then the 2, so if it was John and Jane Jones, you get a J at the top, and then underneath there'd be JA, and that would be the initials of the married couple. Grand dining cups then become popular. Well, they've always have been popular, but they become more common in gentry families. Wealthy family would have a grand dining cup set in front of the master of the house. And this is undoubtedly what the thistle cup was. It's got a wonderful knob at the top with this figure on it, a very elegant cover, and then a typically shaped, slightly curved beaker shape down to where the stem begins. And the scrolled work on the cover is repeated on the stem. So beautiful piece of work. It's in the St. Peter's Treasury here. And you'll be able to see that when you have a chance to go and look at it. What happened with this sort of plate? This was made, as you can see, in 1543-4. It was never made to go in a church. In those days, before before Elizabeth I's day, the shape of a chalice was defined by law as being the traditional chalice shape, a bowl, a stem, a big knob in the middle, and a great spreading foot. That was how they had to be. But after the Reformation, and particularly towards the end of the 16th and into the 17th century, it becomes more frequent for people to give or leave their dining cup to their local church to be used as a chalice. And this is undoubtedly what happened to the thistle cup, and certainly also to a cup of an even earlier date, 1530 to 31, which ends up at Wood Dorling, was made in London. And again, you can see it is not a proper chalice shape. In fact, there's a similarity between the two, except that whereas the thistle cup body is all in one piece, this cup very unusually unscrews, the bowl and the stem unscrew, and the little acanthus bit is on a ring that fits over the stem, and then you screw it all together. And it has a copy, because William Cobbold made another, very similar in style, which has ended up at St Andrew's Church in Norwich. So both made, I suspect, as secular dining cups, both ending up in different churches when this fashion for giving this sort of thing to a church happened. And we've got a wonderful example in St. Peter Mancroft Treasury. They have an example of practically anything. You just have to look. The Glean cup, and we know all about the Glean cup because in his will, Peter Glean records it. That gilt cup or piece of plate with a cover, which I bought of the executors of John Suckling, to be used as a communion cup forever. I do keep pointing out that it does say used. Wonderful. Used at Christmas. So there. And Suckling died in 1627, so Peter Glean bought it then, and then when Peter Glean eventually died, it came to the church. And you find exactly the same thing happening in St. Peter Hungate, when a cup is given by Thomas Lane and Mary, his wife. And in St. Andrews, where we know Nathaniel Remington gave, probably it went to the church when he died, because we can actually identify that although it was made 1617 to 18, it cannot have been given before 1627, because it's recorded on the cup, Nathaniel Remington Alderman, and he became an alderman in 1627. So he must have been an alderman, and I suspect it was on his death that he gave it. Now again, you see, just as with the buffet in a house, what they would have done was they would have taken these drinking cups and put them on the altar or on a side table like a buffet. Even when they weren't in use, they would have been shown off. And I think in a way it was the gentry taking control of their local churches and saying, this is the dining experience, because communion had changed from a sacrament to a commemorative meal, really. And so this dining experience idea extends from your home to your church. One of the nicest ones, it's not that big, it's a more normal size than these great standing cups, but is the Beeston cup, made in Norwich in 1635 to 6. If you're wondering why there's always two dates, it's because the year when they mark starts in September. So it always runs through to the following August. So that's why you end up with two dates, unless it's specified on the piece that it was made or given in a particular year. We tend to put the two. So the Beeston cup was given to, and I suspect this might be another reason why some of these things ended up in a church. I suspect that by 1744 it had gone out of fashion. And it was a case of, what do we do with this cup? Oh, why don't we give it to the church as a communion cup? They gave the cup, they didn't give the cover. The cup, perhaps the church didn't want the cover, but they found the cover in Beeston Hall in the 20th century, and it has now been reunited. So now it all stands, or it did, until they've remodeled the keep. It stood in a case in the castle keep, all together again. And these lovely little steeples that were a fashion in the early 17th century. And if you go into the cathedral treasury when it opens again, unfortunately COVID restrictions mean it's not open at the moment, there's a whole case of pieces that have been given to churches that were domestic table plate, domestic silver. It includes the Remington cup, it includes the wood Dorling cup, there's a wine cup that was also given, a couple of porringers, these two-handled cups for sweet wine, and a sweetmeat dish, which was used as a pattern, but originally you took round the sort of marzipan bits and pieces on it at the end of the meal. So as time goes on, you find more and more grand things being made for dining tables. On the left we have a very grand quart tankard. And the interesting thing is that the coat of arms on it is of a woman, Elizabeth Cook, who was from the family at Burapton. And it was made by one of the local makers in Norwich, Arthur Hazelwood, and then is now in the Gregory Peck collection in America. And no, I didn't know he was a silver collector either until we borrowed it back for the exhibition in 2004. And on the right, a beaker about this size, also made by Hazelwood, and that would be perhaps for a woman's vessel, light, small, or even for children. Silver beakers become popular. But if you couldn't afford silver, you still went on with pewter. So in this picture, you've got a quart tankard, pewter tankard. In the middle, it's not very easy to see, but that's horn. That's another material that was used quite a lot. And then on the right-hand side, a pint tankard. So these also would have been used on the table. I've mentioned pewter plates, and you will see that pewter, when it's new, looks the same colour as silver. The thing is, as it ages, it goes dark and grey. But if you were to get hold of new pewter, if you go to a jeweller's, you will find new pewter. And then you can see how similar to silver it was. So when you used pewter on your table, you were really mimicking the silver. But if you did use silver, again, these you could have silver dining plates, very grand silver plates and dishes on the left, and again, they might well turn up in the church, as the one at the top left is in the treasury here. The one on the top right is actually used as a pattern in a church, and the one at the bottom right was obviously converted, I suspect, from a silver dining plate to an offertory plate, because the inscription round the edge reads, he who gives to the poor lends to the Lord. But these would undoubtedly have started life as dining plate. And for your wine, as I say, you would need flagons. And this is a lovely pair of flagons. And it's now, they belong to Westacre Church in West Norfolk. But they were clearly not made for that any more than the Beeston cup was made as a communion chalice. They've got strange figures, sea creatures, and all sorts of things, and flowers on them. And again, one suspects that at some point or other, the Lord of the Manor gave them to the church, either because they needed more wine, more flagons for wine, or because this was another piece of the buffet plate that would be set on the altar to impress. So we get to the end of the 17th century, and suddenly everything changes. That's an exaggeration, but in come new materials, new ideas, new fashions, and the old pewter and silver and trenchers disappear. And we get to what we would recognise as a dining table. China comes in. Chinese porcelain begins to be brought across in the 17th century, but particularly, arrives, one could say, at the beginning of the 18th. New types of dining ware, forks arrive, flatware, and of course, tea and coffee. Dining tables appear very different. Yes, you might still have the odd silver serving dishes, but you would have your china and you would have glass. Glass factories were beginning to be set up. And in the centre, you would start to get these great table centres. Well, they already had them in grand banquets even earlier. They would make sugar or marzipan confections, some looking like castles or ships or whatever. And of course, the benefit was that at the end of the meal, you broke them up and ate them. But this could get expensive. So after a while, you stop having the sugar confection and you replicate it in some sort of porcelain or ceramic. And so you get china decoration. I'm not quite sure, this is a reconstruction from a National Trust property, and I'm not quite sure whether that one is a sugar confection or china, but I suspect china. Wedgewood, in the middle of the 19th century, sets up his factory and produces creamware. And this then becomes a popular colour or style for the dining table. Even up to Queen Caroline's tea table, you get Wedgewood creamware. So, new things appear. Another dining table, a proliferation of forks and knives, glasses, the very popular blue and white based on the Chinese porcelain, copied by English factories, then copied by the Chinese as an export product, who were copying the English fashion rather than their own original fashion, and then shipped back to Europe. International trade. And the East India Company, of course, was, and before them the Dutch, were bringing in these wonderful new developments, and everybody wanted to be up with the curve. And you do find this reflected even in what was advertised for sale. Nathaniel Rowe, the goldsmith in the marketplace, has been to the India sale, which clearly means the East India Company's sale, and has bought superfine tea, coffee, and a great variety of chinaware. The goldsmiths were having to diversify because no longer were they needed to produce silver cups and beakers and things. Everybody wanted the latest china now. So they became purveyors of luxury goods, essentially. And here we have two English items made in the Chinese style and colour. So we've got a tea bowl from the Worcester factory and a nice little teapot from Lowestoft factory. And if you were having your portrait painted now, instead of the silver spoon, you would have a tea table. And this is at Goldsmiths Hall in London, this one. I don't know who the family is, but they're casual because he hasn't got his wig on. He's taken his wig off and put a turban on, so it's very laid back. And there they all are with their tea bowls and with their teapot on its stand and the coffee pot and the sugar bowl and the slop bowl, the tea caddy, and then this other new development, teaspoons. Small spoons to stir your tea with. And in the collection, in the Tictum collection, we've got quite a number of teaspoons. Little collection there. They did start to be made in sets. And on the right, a London set by William Soame. And of course, you then get rid of all the old stuff that's been hanging around in the back of the cupboard for ages, which has now gone out of fashion. And this, sadly, from our point of view, if we're looking back, is where we lose a lot of these wonderful Tudor and Stuart pieces of silverware. Because, of course, the value is in the bullion. That's, you know, it doesn't matter if it's melted down and turned into something else. The real value of a piece of silver to the people at the time was how much silver there was in it. And even today, you know, bring in your old scrap gold and silver, it says at the shops, and we'll give you a good price for it. And that was what they did then. And we have an example in the corporation records, Nathaniel Rowe, who incidentally is buried at the back of the church here, he and his wife Anne. He melted down belly pots, which were serving jugs, which were rounded in shape, salvers, pottingers, salts, spoons, and then he produced new salvers, upmarket, up-to-date salvers, a pair of sauce boats, which are illustrated there, 8 salts and 12 spoons, all London. That was the other fashion. The local goldsmiths' wares, even if they were good quality, were not considered as good as getting it from London. So you find that the local goldsmiths become retailers of London ware. This was a bit of a fashion that had been going on since the beginning of the 17th century. The laws of the goldsmiths, the rules and regulations of 1624, actually make regulations about if you are selling London plate, it must be properly hallmarked. So we know they were selling it. And so, but this really hit in the early 18th century. And to be frank, some of the local goldsmiths didn't want to make some of the London plate, not coffee pots and teapots and things, because they were fiddly. And you needed equipment that they didn't think it was worth buying. So it was easier to buy them in. The next development is plate, Sheffield plate. It came about by accident. A man called Thomas Bolsover in Sheffield was mending a silver-handled knife, and he overheated it, and the silver melted into the copper and fused with the copper. He could still see the two layers, but they operated as one. He could actually work it as one thing. And so he discovered Sheffield plate. And of course, this was cheaper than silver, but it looked exactly the same from the outside. So we moved from silver to plate, and the same variety of goods that you would have found in silver could be replicated in plate. And that meant it went slightly further down the social scale again. Any middle-class person worth their salt would have a nice collection of silverware on their tables, but it might half of it be plate. Here is an 18th century tea set of plate. And it was very difficult to tell. I think all this is silver, but most of it. But a couple of bits might be plate, but unless you actually turn it round and look for the marks, you cannot tell the difference. And a typical setting by this time, by the time you get towards the end of the 18th century, you are starting to get this desire to prove, I think, your superiority by not just having a knife and fork, but by having a knife and fork or spoon and fork or whatever for every possible circumstance. And so you get these table settings of 3 lots of forks and knives. So you've got the soup spoon and the fish knife and the dinner knife and the dessert knife and the dessert spoon and fork. And then you've got the serving spoons, tablespoons. It's interesting, we call them that. The idea that now you have things that are set on the table as opposed to bringing your own spoon. They are tablewares. And we get into the Victorian dining table, covered in stuff. Umpteen knives and forks. Umpteen glasses. You had a different shaped glass for everything. And then you get the great table centre of flowers or whatever. And by the time you'd added the candlesticks, which were a necessity, of course, if you were going to see what you were eating, and the napkins that have evolved into these rather grand shapes that they could produce. But you have to starch them an awful lot to get to that. Then all the serving bits and pieces and the little containers for condiments and, the table is becoming crowded. And this is from Mrs. Beaton's cookery book of 1905. So it's exactly the same. So it looks a little less crowded, but we've still got the same elements. By now we've got oil lamps down the centre with very elegant shades. And you've got some bits of decorative ware, just as we've got here, which this belongs to St. Peter Mancroft. This was given by Lord Mancroft to the church, and we're still debating what he thought it was going to be used for, but it makes a very grand table centre. And then you've got the things to stand grapes on and all that, accoutrements. And that you have to have soup ladles, and you have to have other serving elements, because now you have a lot of courses. There were always a lot of courses in a meal, and there was a mixture in each course of savoury and sweet. You didn't go through from, a starter to a main to a sweet. There was a separate dessert course, which tended to be lighter with jellies and that sort of thing. And after the 2 or 3 main courses, which, as I say, would have different meats and fowl and that sort of thing, plus some sweet dishes, then the table would be cleared and reset, and that was the point at which the meal tended to become less formal. Meals were very formal in the 18th and into the beginning of the 19th century. Even drinking was a formality. You didn't just drink when you felt like it. In order to take a glass of wine, sip of your wine, you were supposed, in very polite company, to look round to catch the eye of another diner, and then you would each raise your glass to the other and then drink. I'm not sure how well it worked in everyday circumstances, but that's what it says in the etiquette books. So there was a lot of refilling of wine glasses and lots of servants, and this is where you come down to the next bit, because we mustn't forget the influence of service. A large household, and I just happened to find this online, of the servants at Curramore House in Ireland. Of course, they themselves had a hierarchy, and you progressed upwards in the chain of servants, so that the housekeeper, for example, as we know, if you see some of these dramas, was waited on hand and foot, essentially, by the other servants. She didn't hardly, she was in control of things, she organised things, but she didn't do a lot of actual physical work. And you had your place in the household, and you learned the proper way of laying a table, you learned the proper knife to use and the proper plates to have. So when you married, even if you were living in a little cottage, you would want to set up your table as it had been set up in the big house. And so you might be only able to afford some cheap china. You might be able to afford 1 or 2 plated items that you would bring out on special occasions. And who among us can't remember, the great aunt who insisted upon the butter knife and the jam spoon and all the pickle fork and all the other bits that basically said to everybody, this is what refinement looks like. And this is where it goes right down the social scale. Pieces could be remade, repositioned if they went out of fashion. So a simple salver, flat salver that perhaps started life on a side table in the hall where people will put visiting cards on, turns into a cake plate with the addition of a foot. And we've got it on the table here. And so people would make use of older things, and perhaps that might be owned by somebody who was slightly less wealthy, but still wanted to appear grand. And the Victorians became quite adept at producing all sorts of fancy items. Obviously, we have a dessert spoon on the left with a shell pattern. In the middle, we've got probably, I think it might be a salad server, one pair of a salad servers, because it's got Judy on it, and there must have been a punch. So a couple of serving spoons, and these very decorated spoons, which people might give as a wedding gift. We move into the 20th century, and then new materials come. We've got chrome. Chrome plating becomes popular. Art Deco, very simple styles. Then we get further on, we get stainless steel. Even plastic comes in. So new materials reproducing in a way, but in a new way, the art of dining and making. And a modern table still has these elements. It doesn't matter how modern it might look, but we have got rid of the various types of the great table settings of 5 or 6 different knives and forks, perhaps, but we've still got the table centres, we've still got the dishes and the bowls in the middle, and we've still got the buffet. But now we've taken you through right to modern days and reminded you of this gradual movement of fine dining and elegant tables moving down the social scale so that everybody feels in some way they can participate in this dining experience. Success is not reserved for a selected group of people who have silver spoons in their mouths. So do enjoy going and seeing the exhibition there and come and have a look at the table here. Thank you very much for listening.
It falls to me on your behalf to say and offer a vote of thanks to Mary this morning, and also to Sue for bringing lots of the Titcombe collection to church as well. So it's wonderful to have it on display in our treasury. Today we've learned all about the thistle cup, sweetmeat dishes. A sweet dish I can remember coming into the cathedral when I was there, being quite black, similar colour to the pewter down here, and it was found in a box and they weren't quite sure what to do with it. And so I handed it over to the person who at that time was a guy called Nigel Bumfrey, and then it was identified as being what it is, and the next time I saw it, it was beautifully shiny and is beautifully now displayed in there. It actually belonged to, I believe, was it Ratkeith Church it came from, if I remember right. So we've looked about eating things that are made of wood, of bread, of pewter, of silver, silver gilt. We talked about today and heard today about trenchers and bowls, cups, chalices and beakers. And it is quite an amazing thing to think how at one point it started off so very simply on that end. In the heart of it, it got quite complicated by the Victorian times and centerpieces. But of course, nowadays, when we sit at home with our TV dinners, it's frequently maybe a tray and a bowl, a knife and a fork, and a glass at the side. So dining has certainly changed over the years. So can I once again say thank you to Dr. Mary Fewster for her talk this morning. And if anybody's watching online and they want to come and hear it in person, it is on again this afternoon at 2 o'clock, so do come back. Tomorrow, we've got a talk on Tales of Norfolk and the Nation by Dr. Tim Pastell, who is one of the curators, a senior curator of archaeology at the Norwich Museum. He's going to take us through an illustrated journey of Norfolk's history, looking at a selection of objects that evoke our history and the prominence of Norfolk, both locally and nationally. So if you're around at 11:30, watch online or come into church and watch it then. And on Saturday, behind us, we're reminded, as it well is in the front, Mancroft has got 2 church organs, and the talk on Saturday is entitled The Playing of the Merry Organ and Sweet Singing in the Choir. And Michael, who has been previously a director of music elsewhere and is also nowadays our comms guy here at St Peter Mancroft, he's going to be giving us a talk and also a demonstration about the 2 organs we have in church. So if you're around, do come and listen or watch online. Once again, Dr. Mary Fewster, thank you for coming and bringing the items to us. And if you're in church, do come and have a look close up. Thank you very much.